And therefore, vast portion of the population became immersed in that idea that stability meant autocracy. That idea is still very powerful in China today.
Dr. Huang, please explain stability and scope, terms that you use in your book. In the context of China's history, are scale and stability sort of synonymous?
In the context of Chinese history, it is. Um, the
What do
scale
they
of,
mean?
well, okay, so the scale of the government, it's related to the exam system, right? So if you could have hundreds of thousands of people indoctrinated very effectively in the same ruling ideology, you could extend that ruling ideology to a big territory more than you would if you didn't have this unifying system. And the ideology itself is very much about the rule of autocrats, the rule of autocracy, the virtue of it, the sanctity of it. Right? So these two things go exactly with each other together. The literacy, what I call the exam literacy in China, is not about liberalization, equality, and rights and things like that, right? It is all about the virtue of the emperor, the virtue of authoritarianism, and therefore, vast portion of the population became immersed in that idea that stability meant autocracy. That idea is still very powerful in China today. This is how
Oh, wow.
Chinese leaders today talk about the virtue of their system. They always say, okay, if we implement democracy, what you're going to have is civil war, domestic instability, and then they point to the U.S. January
J-
6th riot
yeah,
and
yeah.
as an example of that. And then they point to India, the chaos there, right? And this is not a one-sided propaganda. A lot of, I would say, vast majority of the Chinese people bought into that idea, and and because for centuries, that was the idea that is being imparted to them through this powerful platform. So it is a ingrained idea in China. Even some very well educated elite, Western educated even, bought into that idea. I don't buy into it. I don't see, if you look at the statistics, autocracies have huge instability. And statistically speaking, it's just nonsense. But what I think doesn't really matter. So many Chinese citizens buy into that idea. And in my book, I argue this is one reason why the Chinese Communist Party can be so durable, despite the fact that there have been so many failures in the history of the Communist Party.
Do you think, huh, do you think one reason that the people of China, historically speaking, put up with autocracy is one reason because of all the dangers that lurked outside their borders, but different tribes from the north, from the northeast, how smaller states, they had periods of smaller kingdoms, but they
Yeah,
couldn't bring stability. Is that one thing? Is that a thing?
yeah, that may be a thing. It, at least in my own thinking, it didn't figure prominently in explaining this acceptance of autocracy. Now, if that's the fear, you shouldn't have that fear today in China, right? So
Great point.
China
Yeah,
has nothing to fear from Mongolia.
exactly.
And even
Yeah,
from Russia, Russia's GDP $1.7 trillion is
yeah,
about the
yeah,
same
yeah,
as
yeah,
one
yeah.
Chinese province, right?
Great
So
point. Uh,
um, and so objectively speaking, I don't think that's a source of that uh, fear. But you're also right that the rulers tend to play up that fear. But now they are pointing to the West, right? They are pointing to the United States.
yeah,
But even when they are pointing to the United States, they never really say U.S. is going to invade China. That's not how they talk about it. They talk about U.S. wants to undermine the Chinese system, and there's a fundamental difference between undermining the system and undermining the country, right?
yeah.
So even that fear should, rationally speaking, should not lead to the idea that I support you because U.S. wants to undermine the system.
So let's talk about scope. We said at the outset of this
Yeah,
segment, we said let's talk about scale and scope. So scope is
yeah.
the second thing.
So the scope in my book has two main dimensions. There could be others, but in my book I talk about two. One is the political scope, and the other is ideological scope. Political scope basically means a diversity of political and administrative entities, right? Think about Europe,
Mm-hmm.
multiple countries, and EU is sort of a collection of the loose collection of these countries, but still these countries are quite separate from each other. In my book, I talk about a Chinese European moment, and that moment was actually a few centuries, almost 4 centuries, from 220 to 580. They were, altogether something like 30 administrative political entities, sometimes in parallel with each other, sometimes sequential with each other, right? They fiercely competed with each other for human capital, for resources, and they also fought with each other, just like European countries
Yeah.
fighting with their 100 years war, 30-year war, right? So they constantly fought with each other. So that's the political scope. The ideological scope, China also had ideological scope for a very long period of its history. It had Confucianism for sure, right? So that's how people today associate China with in terms of ideology. But China also had Buddhism. It was imported into China from India in the first century CE. China also had Buddhism. China had legalism, Mohism, right? China had multiple ideologies for a long stretch of its history. So this is where the civil service exam system did its trick. Because only one ideology was tested, other ideologies were sidelined and marginalized, right?
Ah.
So it led to this ideological homogeneity, first a little bit beginning around 9th century, 10th century, and then decisively after 13th and 14th centuries. Today China has one ideology, whatever ideology you call it, national ideology or communist ideology. That is actually a continuous legacy from this project that began as early as 6th century. So China lost both political scope first in 6th century because China got reunified in 580. And then for the next 400 years, it began to lose ideological heterogeneity. And then China became basically this unified one party system with one dominant and monopolistic ideology. And this is very much China today.
In an earlier conversation with a different scholar, they brought up something along the lines of what you were saying. You talked about small European states that constantly fought each other to just near past. And he said that's one of the reasons why Europe has a more robust financial system, is because many of these small states needed to borrow money to fight. And because of that, financial systems developed in Europe. What I'm wondering is this, going back to this era, 220 to 580, where you had many 30 even administrative systems, some in parallel even. Was this a period of proliferation of ideas and technology and entrepreneurship in China?
Yeah, that was the peak of Chinese technology.
Wow.
That was also the peak of humanistic creation. So when I say
what do you mean by that? Humanistic.
Oh yeah, if you kind of measure, this is probably very crude and primitive, and many humanities scholars will get mad at me. So if you kind of look at per capita production of humanistic output, the number of humanistic works per capita, that was the peak during that period, as well as in our measure, the number of inventions per capita, that was also the peak.
Wow.
So when I say that was the European moment, I meant it both in political, ideological terms, as well as also in technological terms as well, right? Kind of a Renaissance period. And it was the most creative era by far in Chinese history.
By far.
Right? By far. I would say more than, well, I shouldn't say more than today, because strictly on per capita basis, that's not true. But in terms of kind of diversity of ideology, right? In terms of diversity measure, definitely it dwarfed China today. There were multiple ideologies. There were intellectuals who were not part of the state, right? They were independent intellectuals, and they were intellectuals who delighted themselves in challenging the state ideology, right?
Wow.
Try to find 10 of those in China today. Good luck.
Well, you can find hundreds of them outside China, such as yourself, but not in China.
Yeah, that's true. But in China, because they're in jail, right? So it's a remarkable period. It's a period that many historians kind of brush aside and quickly glance over. They don't really focus on that period. But to me, it is actually the most fascinating period in Chinese history.
Because usually when you look at history, you look at maps, how big it is, you look at the political stuff, and let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Huang as we get into the perspective.